Everyone believed the billionaire's son would never speak again. Not the doctors, not the therapists, not even his own father questioned it. For years, the boy lived in the silence, locked inside a world without words, a ghost in his own home. People whispered that money could buy anything except his voice. But everything changed the day a new driver was hired. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't a specialist. He was just an ordinary man and who paid attention. Jonathan Reed was a man admired by everyone. From the outside, he had everything: wealth, influence, and the respect that came with building a global empire from nothing. But behind the gates of his sprawling countryside estate, silence ruled every room. That silence belonged to his only son, Ethan. Once a bright, cheerful little boy, Ethan had not spoken a single word in almost 5 years. It began the night tragedy struck. Jonathan's wife, Claire, was killed in a devastating car accident. Ethan was in the back seat when it happened. He survived the crash without a single injury, but something inside him broke that night. His voice disappeared, swallowed by trauma that no one could reach. Doctors called it selective mutism. Specialists from across the world were flown in. Speech therapists tried games, colors, music, and stories. Psychologists spoke softly, hoping to draw out a hidden response. But nothing worked. Ethan's silence was unshakable. Jonathan blamed himself. He believed that losing Claire was punishment enough, but watching his son live without words felt like an even greater curse. He abandoned public life, pulling away from the boardrooms and flashing cameras, and retreated into the estate. The mansion was magnificent. Marble staircases, chandeliers, endless halls. But without laughter, without conversation, it felt like a museum filled with ghosts. Every room echoed with absence. And in the middle of it all sat Ethan, clutching the same small toy car his mother had given him before she died, his eyes distant, his lips sealed. Jonathan tried everything. He read bedtime stories, his voice trembling as he imitated the characters. He filled the house with tutors and therapists, each promising progress. At night, he sat by his son's bed whispering, "Please, Ethan, just one word. Anything?" But there was never an answer, only the sound of the clock ticking in the silence of a house that had forgotten what joy felt like. Jonathan refused to surrender to despair. If one doctor failed, he brought another. If one therapist had no answers, he flew in a different specialist from another country. Money was no obstacle. He was prepared to spend every dollar if it meant hearing his son's voice again. Over the years, countless experts crossed the threshold of the Reed estate. Speech therapists armed with colorful flashcards, psychologists with gentle tones and patient smiles, neurologists carrying the latest equipment and promising breakthroughs. They all tried. They all failed. Some told Jonathan to be patient. Perhaps Ethan will speak when he feels safe enough. Others shook their heads, whispering that the trauma was too deep, too permanent. A few even suggested that his son might never recover at all. Every time Jonathan heard those words, it was like another blade twisting in his chest, but he refused to stop trying. He read fairy tales in different voices, desperately hoping to see a flicker of recognition. He filled the house with music, with colors, with games meant to spark joy. He bought the finest toys, arranged playrooms that looked like wonderlands, and begged Ethan to join him. But Ethan remained unchanged, silent, expressionless. His small hands always holding that same toy car, his gaze fixed on the window as if he were searching for someone who would never return. Late at night, when the staff had gone to bed, Jonathan would kneel beside his son's chair and whisper through tears, "It should have been me, not her. I should have protected you both." Ethan never looked at him, never moved, never spoke. The estate, with all its wealth and beauty, felt less like a home and more like a prison made of silence. And Jonathan Reed, once a man of towering confidence, now looked hollow, a shadow of himself, carrying the unbearable weight of hope, slowly turning into despair. Jonathan eventually realized that even the staff around him had grown numb to Ethan's silence. They moved through the mansion like ghosts themselves, polite, efficient, but detached. So when his old driver retired, Jonathan didn't think much about replacing him. But fate has strange ways of sending the right person at the right time. That was the day Daniel Cole walked through the estate gates. He was 35, tall but modestly built, with worn shoes and a quiet presence. Unlike the polished candidates who arrived in press suits and perfect resumes, Daniel seemed ordinary. He carried a weathered leather bag, his hair slightly unkempt, his expression humble yet thoughtful. Jonathan asked him only one question. Do you know how to keep quiet when needed? Daniel met his gaze and simply nodded. That was enough. Jonathan hired him on the spot. But what Jonathan didn't know was that Daniel carried his own scars. A year earlier, he had lost his younger sister to a sudden illness. The grief had hollowed him out, carving lines of sorrow across his face. Silence wasn't uncomfortable for Daniel. Silence was something he had been living with ever since. On his very first day, Daniel noticed the atmosphere inside the mansion. It was beautiful, grand, and perfectly kept, but empty of life. The chandeliers sparkled, the marble floors shone, but there was no warmth, no sound of joy, only the heavy stillness of grief. And then Daniel saw Ethan. The boy sat by the tall window, clutching his small toy car, his eyes distant as if staring into another world. The staff walked past him without hesitation, as though his silence had become part of the furniture. Something expected, something permanent. But Daniel didn't walk past. He slowed his steps, crouched slightly so his eyes were level with the boy's, and said in a gentle voice, "Hello there, young man." Ethan didn't respond. Not a glance, not a sound, but Daniel smiled anyway, as if the boy had answered. And the next day, when he passed Ethan again, he repeated the greeting. And the day after that, always with the same gentle tone, always with the same patience. Daniel didn't try to force words out of him. He didn't see Ethan as a broken case to be solved. He simply treated him like a child. And that, unknowingly, was the very beginning of everything. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel kept to his quiet routine. He drove Jonathan to his meetings, handled errands, and blended into the background just like the rest of the staff. But there was one difference. He never ignored Ethan. Every morning, Daniel would pause by the boy's chair and say gently, "Good morning, Ethan." Every evening, he'd repeat the same words. "Good night, young man." It didn't matter that there was no reply. Daniel spoke to him as though he was listening, because in his heart, he believed the boy was. One afternoon, while cleaning the car in the garage, Daniel heard something faint. He froze, holding the cloth still. From the back seat came a low, almost unnoticeable hum. Daniel turned his head. Ethan was sitting there, his small hands gripping the toy car, his lips moving ever so slightly. The sound was soft, but it had a rhythm. He was humming in time with the car's indicator light, ticking on and off. Daniel's chest tightened. It wasn't speech, but it wasn't silence either. It was sound. He didn't call anyone. He didn't rush to Jonathan. Instead, he crouched quietly by the car door and whispered, "That's a good tune, Ethan. Keep going." The boy didn't look at him, but Daniel noticed something. Just for a moment, Ethan's eyes flickered, as though he had registered the voice. From that day, Daniel began experimenting, not with therapy techniques, but with simple, everyday sounds. While walking past the hall, he would whistle a soft melody. While carrying tools, he tapped them gently on the railing in rhythm. While closing the garage door, he let it creak slowly like a drawn-out note. Each time, he watched Ethan closely, and each time, there was something, tiny but undeniable. A slight tilt of the head, a pause in his breathing, the faint twitch of his fingers around the toy car. It was as if Ethan's silent world wasn't completely closed. As if, somewhere deep inside, he was listening. Responding, reaching out in ways no one else had noticed. One evening, Daniel deliberately dropped a wrench on the concrete floor. The clang echoed sharply through the garage. Ethan flinched, his eyes darted toward the sound, then quickly away. Daniel's heart pounded. He leaned forward, whispering under his breath, "You can hear me, can't you? You've been hearing everything all along." It happened on a stormy night. Rain hammered against the tall windows of the estate, and thunder rolled across the sky like a drumbeat. Most of the staff had retired early, but Daniel lingered in the garage, making sure the cars were covered. Through the sheets of rain, he noticed a small figure standing near the doorway. Ethan. The boy's tiny shoulders trembled, his toy car clutched tightly in his fist. Each crash of thunder made him flinch, his wide eyes reflecting fear he couldn't express. Daniel's heart clenched. Slowly, he walked over, crouching to the boy's level. He didn't speak at first. Instead, he began humming the same gentle tune he whistled every day, a melody Ethan had heard dozens of times before. The boy's breathing slowed. His gaze shifted from the storm outside to Daniel's face. And then, in the softest, almost broken whisper, Ethan's lips moved. One word escaped. "Mama?" Daniel froze, his throat tightening. For a moment, he thought he had imagined it. But then Ethan's lips moved again, just barely louder this time. "Mama." Tears filled Daniel's eyes. He placed a trembling hand on the boy's shoulder and whispered back, "She's here with you, Ethan. She's always been here." Ethan blinked rapidly as if fighting through layers of silence and fear. And then, for the first time in nearly 5 years, he turned his head toward another human being, his eyes locking onto Daniel's. The storm still raged outside. But inside that moment, something far greater had broken through. A single word, fragile but real, carrying the weight of years of silence. The moment was fragile, like glass, one word echoing in a house that had forgotten voices. Daniel wanted to hold on to it, to let Ethan stay in that quiet miracle for as long as possible, but fate chose otherwise. The heavy footsteps of Jonathan Reed echoed down the corridor. He had returned early from the city, weary and tense from another long day of meetings. As he entered the hall, his sharp eyes immediately landed on the scene, his silent son standing close to the new driver. "What is going on here?" Jonathan's voice was sharp, almost accusatory. Daniel rose quickly, unsure how to explain, but before he could speak, Ethan clutched his toy car tightly and whispered again, barely audible, "Mama?" Jonathan froze. The word hit him like a lightning strike. For a heartbeat, he couldn't breathe, couldn't believe what he had just heard. His eyes flicked to Daniel, suspicion and disbelief clouding his face. "What did you do to him?" he demanded, his voice breaking between anger and desperation. "You think you can just play games with my son? Do you have any idea how many so-called experts have tried and failed?" Daniel shook his head firmly. "No games, sir." He said it himself. He's been listening all along. He just needed... He hesitated, searching for the right word. Someone to notice. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue, to dismiss this man's claim as coincidence or wishful thinking. But then Ethan turned, slowly, hesitantly, and looked directly at his father. The boy's lips trembled, and in a shaky voice he whispered again, "Mama, light." Jonathan's knees nearly gave way. Tears filled his eyes as he stumbled forward, dropping to his son's level. "Ethan, my boy," he choked out, his voice trembling. He reached for his son's hand, gripping it tightly, afraid that if he let go, the moment would vanish. The boy's small fingers curled weakly around his father's. It wasn't a full conversation, it wasn't a miracle cure, but it was proof. Proof that his son's voice had never been truly gone. Jonathan's gaze lifted to Daniel, still wet with disbelief and emotion. For the first time in years, hope flickered across the broken father's face. And in that flicker, Jonathan realized, this ordinary man might have succeeded where every expert had failed. After that night, nothing inside the Reed estate felt the same. For years, the mansion had been a tomb of silence. Now, even the faintest word from Ethan carried more weight than all the riches in Jonathan's vaults. Daniel kept working patiently, never rushing the boy. Each day, he found small ways to draw Ethan out. Simple sounds, gentle tunes, quiet words. And slowly, like cracks appearing in a wall, Ethan began to respond. At breakfast one morning, when Jonathan placed a glass of juice in front of him, Ethan whispered, "Thank you." The fork fell from Jonathan's hand. Tears welled in his eyes as he pulled his son into his arms. Day by day, progress continued. Ethan pointed to objects, whispered single words, then short phrases. He giggled faintly when Daniel whistled his tune. The boy who once lived behind unbreakable silence was now stepping, word by word, into the world again. But with progress came questions. Jonathan began reviewing Ethan's old medical reports. Why had every specialist failed? Why had none of them noticed his sensitivity to rhythm, sound, and melody? When Jonathan sought answers, the truth was disturbing. One highly paid doctor had written off Ethan's condition in haste, prescribing heavy medication that may have dulled his natural responses. Other clinics had cared more about billing hours than uncovering the truth. The press caught wind of Ethan's sudden progress. Whispers spread. The billionaire's mute son is speaking again. Soon reporters camped outside the estate gates, hungry for details. Jonathan, once reclusive, now stood before the cameras holding Ethan's hand. "My son was never broken," he said firmly, his voice carrying both anger and pride. "He was ignored, overlooked, treated as a case instead of a child. It took an ordinary man, our driver, Daniel, to see what the world's finest specialist did not." The story exploded across headlines. A father's fortune couldn't buy his son's voice, but patience found it. Driver succeeds where doctors failed. Families wrote letters thanking Jonathan for exposing the negligence of so-called experts. Hospitals scrambled to defend themselves, but the damage was done. People demanded accountability. Jonathan made sure they got it. He filed formal complaints against the doctor who had medicated his son without cause. Investigations followed. The name that once carried prestige was now dragged through the mud, a warning to every parent. Never stop questioning, never stop hoping. Weeks passed, and with each one, Ethan's voice grew stronger. At first, it was only scattered words. "Thank you," "light," "car." Then came short phrases, stitched together with effort. And soon, whole sentences began to take shape. One evening, Jonathan walked into the study and found his son sitting with Daniel at the piano. Daniel pressed a few keys, creating a soft melody. To his amazement, Ethan whispered along, his tiny voice stumbling but determined, as he repeated the notes like words. Jonathan's throat tightened. He hadn't just regained a son who could speak. He was watching a boy discover joy again. At dinner, Ethan looked across the table and said softly, "Papa, can you pass the bread?" Jonathan nearly dropped the plate in shock. It was so ordinary, so simple. Yet to him it was a miracle. He laughed, tears streaming down his face as he handed the bread across. The mansion, once cold and lifeless, now echoed with small voices, with hesitant laughter, with the fragile but beautiful sound of healing. Even the staff, who had once walked through the halls like shadows, now smiled and spoke more freely, carried by the change radiating from the boy. And Jonathan began to see Daniel differently. This was not just an employee. This was the man who had given him back his son. One night, standing by the fireplace, Jonathan placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder and said quietly, "I hired you as a driver, but you've become something far greater. You're family now, Daniel." Humbled, only nodded. He didn't need recognition. Watching Ethan's transformation was enough. For the first time in years, Jonathan Reed no longer felt like a man trapped in grief. He was a father again, and with Ethan's fragile but growing voice filling the house, life returned to the home that once felt like a mausoleum. Months later, a small community event was held at Ethan's school. Parents filled the hall, whispering as they waited for the children's short performances, simple recitations, songs, and stories. When Ethan's name was called, Jonathan's chest tightened. For years he had imagined this moment, but never believed it would come. His son walked slowly onto the stage, clutching his little toy car, the same one he had held through every year of silence. The hall went quiet. Teachers stood nervously at the side, prepared to intervene if the boy froze. But then Ethan stepped up to the microphone. His voice was soft, trembling, but steady. "My name is Ethan Reed," he said. "I couldn't speak for a very long time. Everyone thought I was lost, but someone believed I wasn't." Jonathan's eyes blurred with tears as he leaned forward in his chair. On the side of the hall, Daniel stood quietly, his arms folded, his expression calm but proud. Ethan raised his toy car for everyone to see. "This was my mother's last gift to me. It kept me company when I couldn't talk, but the first light I ever saw didn't come from this car, or even from my eyes." He looked toward Daniel. It came from his heart. The audience erupted into applause. Jonathan covered his face, overwhelmed by sobs of relief and joy. For him, no business success, no fortune, no empire could ever match the miracle of hearing his son speak these words. And as the applause filled the hall, Daniel quietly stepped back, content in knowing that sometimes the greatest healers are not the ones with titles or degrees, but the ones who simply notice and never stop believing.